Good evening, everyone. I'm Peter Phillips, and I'm the president of the Wagner Society of New York. I welcome you to this beautiful evening for an exciting program. And for those of you who are online, we have almost 100 people who are also watching tonight. In some cases, good morning, actually, and in other cases, good evening to those of you who are with us by live stream. Before we begin, I would just like to remind you of a few upcoming events for the Wagner Society of New York. We will be having our annual Wagner's Birthday recital the day before Wagner's birthday on Sunday the 21st of May with a wonderful mezzo-soprano, Shelley Kravitz, who is someone who I hope you either know or, believe me, you soon will know about. And on the 7th of June, Thomas Geiges, who is the conductor of the Met productions of Die Fliegende Holländer, will be joining us in the afternoon for a 4 o'clock conversation. It's being held at 4 here in this room because that evening at 8 he will be on the podium conducting at the Metropolitan Opera. I don't know if you know him, but I'm of an age where almost everybody that I see looks like a kid, and Mr. Gugais is no exception. He really is a very young, very exciting, very dynamic German conductor. The Met is lucky to have him, and we are thrilled to host him. Finally, I want to remind those of you who are members that we received a substantial block of tickets to Bayreuth this year. I believe that there are some tickets that have not yet been purchased. So if anyone is interested, they are to the Ring Cycle, Parsifal, which is a new production, and Tannhäuser, the last full week in August. And I encourage you to consider taking advantage of your privileges as a member and joining us in Bayreuth. As in the past, we will be having a series of special events there in Bayreuth, and they will consist of 5 different mornings where singers from the festival will be joining us for an informal conversation, starting with Stefan Gould on the 21st, Monday the 21st of August, and going through the rest of the week. So do consider joining us in Bayreuth. There's nothing like it, and it's a great privilege. It's what brought me to the Society, and I hope it's what brought many of you to the Society. Michael Steinberg. I bought this book a few years ago called The Trouble with Wagner. And I didn't realize at the time how exciting the book was, because it wasn't just talking about the trouble with Wagner. It was talking about it from the point of view of someone who had acted as a dramaturge to a production of The Ring that was done under Barenboim's direction and Guy Cartier as the stage director at La Scala. And behold, I had this on the shelf too, so I was having the book on one hand and watching The Ring on the other hand, and it really was quite an extraordinary experience. Little did I know that I would have the opportunity both to meet him and to introduce him to the members of the Wagner Society. So, Michael Steinberg, welcome.
All right with everybody, I may stand up and sit down at some point, but I will have some slides, so I think it'll be easier if I point to the slides from here rather than turning around. Well, thank you so much for the introduction and for the invitation. I'm really very delighted and honored to be here, as I assume a fellow Wagnerian, although not without complications. but that's par for the course, and also as a New Yorker. So if I can introduce myself first in a kind of non-professional way, it's to say that I grew up here in New York. I think the best part of my pre-college education came at the Metropolitan Opera in the 1970s, where I attended 2 to 3 performances a week, courtesy of my small school's membership in the Metropolitan Opera Guild, which enabled me to sit in score desks on the 5th balcony or in the seats next to it for $1.50. And I was greatly admired by the secretary of the school because no student had ever expressed that interest before. And the headmaster for many years threatened to cut the subscription because no student used it. So I used it a lot. I was then a super on stage in several productions. And it really established a kind of love for the work and also a sense of the importance of Wagner at the center of the repertoire. 2 years into my undergraduate life, I found myself with 2 fairly serious musician friends in Vienna over the summer, and I remember very well opening the newspaper and seeing to our horror a review of the premiere of the Götterdämmerung in Patrice Chéreau's centennial production of The Ring. Some of you may recall that. And there was a picture in the Viennese newspaper, in the Neue Freie Presse, or actually Die Presse. Neue Freie Presse is pre-World War I, that's occupational hazard. In Die Presse, of Hagen carrying a spear, but dressed in a coat and tie in front of a kind of tenement building, which was the second act of Götterdämmerung. And so these 2 friends and I both felt it was our responsibility to see what was going on, even though we obviously didn't have any tickets. And we took a night train and arrived in Bayreuth at 5 o'clock in the morning and slowly made our way up the hill, and just to see what was going on. And of course, the box office wasn't open, but the performance had been sold out for many years. And just at 10 o'clock, to our great surprise, a kind of parade of very elegant Daimler-Benz sedans started driving up the hill. And we got closer to see what was going on. And they were all driven by fairly elderly, very distinguished women. There were no men in the car. And when they got to the little area around the front of the Festspielhaus, no longer accessible to vehicles, by the way, one by one they threw tickets out the window of these cars onto the ground. And we didn't hesitate to pick up these tickets, but I did ask one of these Valkyries what she was doing, and she said, "My husband and I absolutely refuse to be subjected to Götterdämmerung in many senses of the word in this horrible production." So I think if I had to choose one night that changed my life, it would be that night, because I sat in either her seat or her husband's seat in the 4th row and saw the second performance of the Chéreau Götterdämmerung, which I really think caused me to completely renew my sense of the importance of Wagner, the importance of staging, and also how to understand cultural history. So these have become my 2 fields, since I'm lucky to be appointed now both in the Department of History and the Department of Music. And when one studies history, and this is what I tell my students at the very beginning of a semester, it's not a question of having the past unfold in great stories in front of your eyes. It's a question of knowing what questions to ask of the past, how to ask those questions, and how to interpret from a certain position at a different period in time. So there are always 2 positions. There's the object of interest, and then there's the subject asking questions. This is not at all to question what we call objectivity. Objectivity is always there, but objectivity and interpretation come together. And Chéreau's Wagner was exactly that. It wasn't a kind of fantasy or a way of showing off an original idea. It was a deeply historical understanding of how to ask new questions about a work that has been around for a long time and that has enormous importance and enormous complications. So really since that time in my teaching career, I've always taught Wagner. I teach Wagner in music classes, sometimes Wagner courses, and I teach Wagner, more to people's surprise, in history classes. Because in the same way that you can't understand the history of Western music if you leave Wagner out, huge problem in Israel, where in music education there's a big gap and then nobody knows where to restart. So you can't understand Western music, in which I include the Broadway musical and especially film music, because film composers studied with people who were students of Wagner. And so the whole aesthetic of the Hollywood sound is in fact Wagnerian. So every Hollywood film of a certain kind has a Wagnerian argument. So you can't understand the history of post-Wagner music, but you also can't understand the 19th century, its culture and its politics, and to an extent its economy and society, if you don't take Wagner really at the center, possibly along with Karl Marx, and I'll get to that pairing again in a second, but they go together. So the interpretation of Wagner is completely tied to the interpretation of the century, which is, in my view, at the foundation of what we call modernity, or modern taste, or modern politics. You can't understand one without the other. So I hope I convince students, also in history classes, who are not expecting to be subjected to this material, and I hope that I also create some fans of this work. The argument that I make, where I'm not alone, but where there's always disagreement, I welcome disagreement, I welcome debate, I welcome correction. The argument that I make, and I do this as an analyst and also as a lover of this work, which I don't make any apologies for that, is that Wagner tells the most profound psychological truths and has a way into the most profound understanding of human beauty. So there's an enormous amount of beauty and truth in this work. But Wagner also tells terrible lies. So that Wagner is a truth teller and Wagner is a liar. And the problem is, and the really interesting problem is that you can't separate the two. This is probably the most ongoing debate in the Wagner scholarship. Can you separate the music from the ideas? Can you separate the man from the work? And my position is that you cannot separate these two. That the work is complex, it's complicated, it tells profound truths, it tells profound lies, whether it's the prose writing or the music itself, certainly the music drama, and it's that combination that makes him so essential to the development of modern history, culture, and taste. Wagner's unbelievable intelligence also gives him the capacity for self-criticism. So part of the ambiguity involved in this argument is that Wagner sometimes knows when he's lying, and he sometimes corrects himself, and those are enormously exciting moments. And I'd be glad to go into more depth about that, or talk about some examples a little later on, or in the conversation or question and answer, which I'm very happy to have. If you fast forward almost about 30 years, really, to 2008, Peter mentioned Daniel Barenboim. I had developed a fairly close working relationship with Daniel Barenboim in a very different context. But in the fall of 2008, he was in New York to make a very delayed debut, as many of you will remember, at the Met with Tristan. And we had several conversations during that period, and I asked him what was planned for the soon-to-arrive bicentennial of the birth of Wagner. And he said, in fact, he was in the middle of planning a co-production of The Ring, co-produced by La Scala in Milano, La Scala in Milano and the Berlin State Opera. And they had just hired, as you mentioned, Guy Cassiers, a very innovative theater artistic director from Antwerp, the artistic director of the Toneelhuis Theater in Antwerp. And Cassiers had become especially known for very innovative adaptations of very large novel sequences. By Proust's In Search of Lost Time, which he had done in Amsterdam and Rotterdam, and Robert Musil's The Man Without Quality. These are both late 19th century in the case, early 20th century in the case of Proust, a bit later in the case of Musil, enormous novelistic epics of many thousands of pages. And he had put these on the stage. And the La Scala management thought that he would be a good man for The Ring for similar reasons, but they were also worried that as an avant-garde director, he would not have enough of an understanding of the 19th century. So Barenboim said, we're actually looking for someone who can talk with him and talk about the contemporary world and the duration or the afterlife, so to speak, of the 19th century. I think you could see that I was, in a way, leaning forward in my chair, so he asked me if I was interested, and of course I said yes, and I started at that point a 5-year collaboration more with the directorial team than anybody else. And that involved 4 or 5 visits to Antwerp, where they were based, to begin to think about this. And as I often say, it was very similar to sitting in a classroom with a small group of very gifted students. It's just that the end result was not a term paper, the end result was this production, which I think was an enormously successful, although not unproblematic production. And it really became a kind of foretaste of the work I later did in the museum. The big challenge that they faced was devising a production that would please audiences in La Scala and audiences in Berlin. And if you think about these two different audiences, they are different in very profound ways. Obviously, the Italian house is based in an Italian tradition, although the orchestra there is a symphonic orchestra like Vienna or Berlin, and now also the Met, that has its own symphonic tradition. But still, the audience is an Italian audience. My mother is here and she won't let me drink out of a bottle. The La Scala audience is an Italian audience, and the Italian tradition is ultimately, as all really interesting Wagner singers will say today, they didn't used to say that, the vocal tradition is very similar to what you have to do when you sing Wagner. Their opinions in the profession have really changed, but the expectations are different. And of course, the Berlin audience is a German audience, and one reason there are so many Wagner productions in Germany is because there's always another opera house 50 miles away. So if you don't like a production in one house, you can travel in Berlin, you can travel down the street, literally, but you can also travel to anywhere between 200 and 250 opera houses and see another representation of the canon. Obviously, at La Scala, that's not the case. But there's to my mind, a much more interesting reason why German Wagner productions especially are so edgy, in addition to market innovation, market share, so to speak, and that's because they're historically so complicated. So that every production of Wagner has to take the history of Wagner, the political history of Wagner, the history of German taste into account. There is no way to be innocent about Wagner in Germany, which in a way there might still be in Italy, because as I mentioned in the book, in Italy, Wagner is someone else's problem. The audience doesn't really have to worry about it. But for this team, the question was how to devise a production that would be beautiful and seductive, and in a way Italianate, visually as well as musically, because the two orchestras, even with the same conductor, really did play very differently. But also in terms of the general visual and dramatic argument. And I think they did a very good job. The production of The Ring, first of all, was about the standard conflict between power and nature. And in the era of climate change and environmental degradation, that's a fairly easy point to make. And the visual imagery of the production was mostly derived from work of the Canadian photographer Edward Bertinsky. And I have one example of his work here, which is from a large series called Water. And if you look at this image, I think you'll see this very scenic, a very theatrical combination of seductive beauty and environmental truth with these swirls of water somehow relating to a fairly polluted and degraded landscape on the top. So in designing the production, this was the aesthetic that they really worked on. The first scene of Das Rheingold, with Albrecht, whom you see here at the bottom, about to steal the gold, had video cameras hanging from the stage in which Albrecht was trying to watch the Rhine maidens trying to torment him, seduce him, but not sincerely. And it began to make the point to the audience, which I think they got immediately, both in Milan and in Berlin, about a certain drive for power in the modern world being the desire to see everything, to have a kind of bird's eye view of the world, and to be able to control the world through its mediatized existence. In other words, have power through knowledge, but also to be able to tell lies about the world as one sees it. So that what you see here are the hands of, which was a live transmission to the audience, the hands of the Rhine maidens as they try to seduce Albrecht. And in the second scene, you really see the Bertinsky landscape in the back, which appeared and disappeared all the way through. So this landscape that is at once very beautiful, but also shows the kind of result of strip mining and other, in a way, extractions of the work, extractions from nature. And this is scene 2 of the Rheingold, where you see the two giants with the human actors at the bottom left, and then the projections through a screen of the giants as all-powerful on the right. And so again, this combination of the human history of the 19th century and then the power of labor magnified by technology, in this case visual technology, so that what you see is an illusion of enormous power, but actually the two giants are laborers, and you know the story of the unjust compensation of these laborers for their work. There are many productions now that show the human and vulnerable face of Fafner, for example, when he finally dies in the second act of Siegfried. And here, because of this dual projection of the giants, you had it from the beginning. Here is actually the same, a little bit later in the same scene, and there was also the doubling of main characters, in this case Loge on the right, by dancers. And finally, in the third act of third scene of Rheingold, you have Albrecht in his lair in Nibelheim, which became a kind of production studio, kind of Fox News, where he could actually control, or think he could control the world simply by watching everything and watching everybody. Here is the forest scene from Siegfried, which in many ways I think was the most beautiful image. These are very low-budget designs. These are plumbing tubes, which at certain points in this act, through projections, became very beautiful trees in the middle of the forest. But Act 2 of Siegfried, as you know, is all about the legibility and illegibility of the forest, not understanding the language of the forest, not understanding what the bird is telling him until he's able to understand. And so there was a doubling of this visual imagery with these kind of fairly vaguely signaled computer messaging that went up and down like ticker tapes on these trees, and then slowly became legible as leaves during and after the scene of the forest murmurs, which is what's going on now with Siegfried on the left. And finally, Götterdämmerung and the Norns. A visual leitmotif of the production was a series of hanging red threads that were in a way death markers. Whenever a character died on stage, a red line would appear, and these red lines then combined with the rope being woven as a way of weaving narrative by the Norns. And the argument here of a set of scenes that was visually extraordinarily attractive and fluid, with fairly tough messages if you began to read them, I think made this production really very successful. I wrote the program notes, and then in several incarnations later, as we just heard, I collected these into a book that came out in 2018. The cover of the book shows the immolation scene that also had a kind of mixture of beauty and perversion, because somehow the castle of the Gibichungs had become a kind of experiment station where bizarre experiments were being done, although they were never really articulated, with human bodies, with body parts that you see vaguely in a kind of casing just behind these student boys, really, who become the kind of the audience for Brunhilde in her immolation scene. Well, this got us to 2013, and 5 years after that, in 2018, I was very pleased to be invited to curate the exhibition, which I think is the basis for my being here tonight, and I'm very glad to talk about that finally. An exhibition at the German Historical Museum in Berlin. It was the first time that the German Historical Museum had an exhibition on a composer. They're planning a second one on Bach, but they decided to start with Wagner. And there were many reasons for that. I don't really know all of them myself, since they'd already come up with the idea when I got involved. But the German Historical Museum is located on the main thoroughfare of classical Berlin, meaning 18th century Berlin, unter den Linden, which means East Berlin until the fall of the wall in November 1989. So the German Historical Museum, during the years of the German Democratic Republic, was the official state museum to tell German history from the perspective of the German not democratic, not republic. In fact, I was there in 1988 and went through the museum, which was completely falling apart by that point in terms of the actual physical exhibitions. But I actually found the 19th century argument quite persuasive, because unlike the standard historical argument in the West, which was an argument about unification and nationalism, the argument in the East was about class struggle, class division, and, as you would expect, the origins of socialism. But it was a perspective that a mainstream museum, certainly in West Germany, but also in this country, didn't often present. I bring this up now because the idea that the museum had was to have the Wagner exhibition more or less simultaneous with an exhibition on Karl Marx. And at least for the bulk of the 6 months in which the Wagner exhibition would be up, there would be simultaneously an exhibition on Marx. So Marx was born a decade after Wagner, 1823, and although obviously the interests, focal points, and arguments of these two figures are entirely different, there is substantial overlap, especially in the early parts of both their careers. So Wagner begins his career as an unhappy genius, feeling abused and unrecognized in Paris, representing people he met in Paris as entirely hostile to him, which in fact was not the case, and then coming back to Germany and ultimately having some involvement, as you may know, in the uprising and part of the revolutions of 1848, slightly late in Germany, in Dresden, in February of 1849. Karl Marx, in the 1840s, begins to argue what becomes this enormous structural argument about world history, culminating in 19th century class unrest, and ultimately, where he was clearly wrong, the laws of history, as he argued, would produce a single revolution that would abolish the state and create a classless society. This has not happened anywhere in the world. But what they thought of in the museum was a way to bring this early period, 1830s, 40s especially, into dialogue. But the question was, what do you do with a composer in a museum of history? And there we began to have a series of fights, really very friendly fights, I have to say, wonderful people there, but interesting debates. And that is that I found myself taking an argument that was quite different from the argument that I usually make, which is you have to take this guy seriously in history. Obviously, you take him seriously in music. And the argument I had to make in a history museum was you have to have music. You cannot understand Wagner if you don't have music. And they said, well, that's very nice, but we're not a museum of music history, we're a museum of history. And we've never worked with music before. Our spectators don't come to hear music. They come to read and learn about history, especially the school children, because big German museums have state budgets, and a large percentage of their visitors are school children, number one. Number two, most of their visitors, they predicted, would not be Wagnerites from all over Germany, but would never have heard of Wagner, or they only would know that they're not supposed to listen to Wagner because he's so tainted after 1945, which is a kind of knee-jerk reaction that you hear very often in Germany, especially from people who used to be my age when I was young, and now people who are still young and who are students, who say in a kind of, to my mind, knee-jerk way, oh, I can't stand it, I can't listen to it, I can't hear a single note. It's a certain position that is self-protective from the responsibility to take things seriously, from my point of view. So I first argued that, in fact, there were two new productions of The Ring scheduled for two opera houses in Berlin during exactly this period, and that all of these people would be interested in the museum. And secondly, that you simply have to find a way to combine historical explanation and exhibition with an account of the actual work. Because Wagner would not be remembered today for the close to 4,000 pages of prose writings that he wrote, which are 4,000 pages. I only know one person who knows all those pages, and he's a kind of hero because he's so smart and so patient. But he would not be remembered for this writing, which is unfortunately memorable, but not really distinguished. He is, of course, remembered for the work. So even in a historical museum, I argued, you have to take the work seriously and try to combine it. The question then was how to combine it. And we came to a plan that would take seriously a field that has become quite well known within historical scholarship, and that's a field that is usually referred to as the history of emotions. This is a field that is quite developed in Germany, and also has a bunch of scholars writing here in this country in history, also in literary studies, in anthropology, and in various areas where the humanities and the social sciences come together. So that the history of culture is the history of meaning making, and how is meaning made and interpreted, certainly through words, through language, through writing, through texts, through art, but also through that dimension of art that is feeling, is is sentiment, the way you feel about things, which sometimes can be put into words and other times cannot be put into words, which is where scholarship becomes difficult. As I tell my students when we talk about the aesthetic, we usually assume we're talking about philosophy and theory, aesthetic theory, for example, but the term aesthetic simply means feeling or sentiment. When we use the term anesthetic or anesthesia, all of a sudden one gets it. But we don't use the term aesthetic in a simple way, which is too bad, because it simply means something that you feel. So we decided to organize this exhibition in a way that would combine these two senses of the aesthetic, meaning actual artwork, the great music dramas, and also the history of key feelings that describe the life and challenges and debates of the 19th century. So the title in German of the exhibition, here in, right, this, okay, I'll go back, was Richard Wagner und das deutsche Gefühl, which literally would translate as Wagner and German feeling, but it just doesn't work. We had long conversations about this. You just can't say that in English. It doesn't capture what the German title captured, because the German title, Das deutsche Gefühl, is literally German feeling, but it's also feeling German. So what we tried to show was that the importance of Wagner was as someone who actually gave audiences a whole new way of feeling and a whole new way of understanding and articulating the life of their own emotions. I think that's still why Wagner resonates so powerfully to so many people today. But the other dimension that is inseparable from the first was feeling German. So that learning how to feel and learning how to articulate feeling also had a kind of predicate, had a second shoe drops, which is the national feeling, learning how to feel German. Not without ambivalence, but also not without significant problems in the history of German nationalism. So we agreed on the title for the English version, and there's quite a bit of bilingualism in the museum policy there. So the English title was Wagner and the Nationalization of Feeling. Obviously, it's not a word-for-word translation, but it was the best thing we could think of to capture those two dimensions of the relationship between Wagner and, in a way, the education of feeling, or what Flaubert, the great novelist of the same period, in fact called in his incredible novel, the title of which is Sentimental Education, the education of the sentiments. Exactly in this period, the 1860s, where, in fact, the century, if you can say that, is thinking about these things. So we then settled on 4 emotions that all were important, that to some extent are simultaneous. They're somehow always there, but they are also, again, to some extent, not in a perfect way, chronological, both in the history of the century and in the history of Wagner's music dramas, at least in how they're emphasized in different ways. So the first one, alienation, which is where the young Wagner and the young Karl Marx come together. Karl Marx's early theory, which is an economic theory of labor, is a theory of alienation, where the modern worker reduced to a factory laborer is in fact alienated from his or her, because he knew very well there are women as well as men, children as well as adults in the industrial factory. The worker is alienated from his own labor, whereas the way Marx describes pre-modern labor was as a kind of holistic enterprise where in fact every worker was a craftsperson who could enjoy the product of his own craft and labor. And one of his examples is the cobbler or shoemaker, who in fact is an artist as well as a worker, and in fact after a long period of labor has the ability to produce a finished pair of shoes and take pleasure in this work of craft and industry, which is also a work of art, as a perfect pair of shoes. And I know you're now thinking of Hans Sachs in Meistersinger, and you should be, because that's one of the arguments of the Meistersinger. The second argument is that the production of art, which by the end of the opera becomes the production of German art, is in fact exactly the same as the production of shoes. So it's not comic relief that makes Hans Sachs bang on a pair of shoes to critique the making of a song. It's because the argument of the opera is that in fact these two things are totally simultaneous. Alienation for Wagner thus has these classically Marxian elements, but it for him also means the alienation of the unrecognized revolutionary artist, who is also fairly close to the revolutionary politician, even though his involvement in the Dresden Uprising was fairly short-lived. So we focused in this first section of the exhibition on the early Wagner in the context of German, largely political history in the 1840s, largely before the revolutions of 1848. The second emotion, Eros, and Eros obviously coming to its own in all of the Wagner operas, but becoming the central topic in Tristan, which is all about the overwhelming power of Eros as, in fact, another form of alienation, because the symbolism of the night versus the day, of erotic love versus social and political responsibility, and you know this binary is clearly very powerful. Number three, belonging, or Zugehörigkeit. And if you look at the German word Zugehörigkeit, you'll notice that it has hören, listening, at the center, which we don't really know what to make of it, but it's significant that somehow belonging is a sonic and vocal sensation as well as an abstract or only a political one. In other words, belonging is a feeling, it's an aesthetic, and in the German tradition, I can talk well into the night about this if you force me, in the German tradition has an emphasis on the inner life of hearing, very often as a kind of reversal of the dominant explanation that seeing is basically the primary way of connecting to the world through sensation. So belonging, what becomes citizenship, what becomes nationalism, is again chronological in the way Wagner returns to Germany after his exile in Switzerland, ultimately establishes his house in Bayreuth with patronage of Ludwig II, and writes what is really the other side of Die Meistersinger, where belonging, very much represented on stage by the chorus, begins with a church congregation, which is the first time you hear a chorus. Then comes an ariot, which is in a way the kind of vocal and community breakdown of what had been the old way of coming together, end of the second act, and then culminates in the end of the third act as a national group or national unity. So a religious congregation in the first act, a broken society in the second act, and then a national and ultimately, after a short delay, nationalist, very militant nationalist moment at the end of the third act with the final line, which, as you know, has a complex history, honor your German masters. And of course, these are master singers who are being talked about, but the language is obviously very strong, and that takes really Wagner into the 1870s, into the House of Bayreuth as a beautifully planned, not only architectural, acoustic, and theatrical structure, but also as a way of marking a new national unit, geographically very, very cleverly located in the north of Bavaria, which is in a way the old kingdom, over the border from Saxony, Wagner's place of birth, and Prussia in the north, which is the new power center of the unified, and as of 1871, the unified German Empire. Wagner, as a marketing genius, knows exactly how to control the political marketing, you might say, of placing his festival in the city that compromises and covers these various and changing centers of political gravity in German history. And then the last one, the most controversial of the four, ekel, or disgust. What is the effect of this new nationalism on feelings of disgust, which include bodies that are either attractive and appealing or unappealing and repulsive, and cultural political bodies, meaning racism in its various forms, and most particularly anti-Semitism. There's an interesting episode here, and that is we try to corral four very prominent Wagnerians as informal guides to the exhibitions. Two of them weren't able to do it in the end because of scheduling issues, but we were able to spend long hours with both Stefan Herrheim, stage director, the director of one of the recent productions at the Deutsche Oper, the other main opera house in Berlin, and Waltraud Meyer, a great mezzo-soprano who then sang Isolde, probably the great Isolde of the last 30 years, I would say. And we interviewed both of them at some length, and we had videos of their commentary running through the exhibition, along with big victory with the museum, videos of productions of all 10 of the major operas, so that the spectators had to go through a museum exhibition. They saw these videos of Herrheim and Meyer, and then they were able to see very carefully chosen excerpts on video of different productions, very different tastes, different takes of the 10 major music dramas. And we asked both of them to comment on the exhibition according to these four emotions. And when we got to disgust, Waltraud Meyer was appalled. And she said, "There is no disgust in Wagner. It doesn't exist. There's only beauty and love and depth." And I said, "Well, you're obviously not going to talk about disgust." And she didn't. And nobody seemed to have noticed that Herrheim was very willing to go through all of these four, but Waltraud Meyer had no interest in talking about ekel or disgust in any aspect of Wagner. But these were the four organizing principles. And just to show you a few images from objects. This was, it's a very shocking image. It's a newspaper image from 1848. And I used this in class quite successfully. It shocks the students. You might be interesting to know probably more than it shocks this group. But in 1848, when German nationalism was still dominated by liberalism, these two political energies going together, liberalism meaning to unify the nation as a parliamentary constitutional structure with a constitution and parliament that would be in Frankfurt, and there was a very short-lived Frankfurt parliament put together in 1848, which was summarily rejected by Frederick William IV, who was the king of Prussia at the time, and said this will never last. And here you have a reaction to this rejection, which shows the various members of the political class and civil society on the bottom, and the king vomiting into them, over them, and into them as a way of making quite clear that he was not interested in what they were doing. And the failure of the parliament, the Frankfurt Parliament of 1848, is an extremely important event in the kind of slow and inexorable conservatism and reaction that takes over the sense of national unity in Germany from 1848 and then certainly into the period of unification in 1870. 1870 means Bismarck, and here's a kind of treasure which the museum staff came up with, and that is Bismarck as Siegfried. So here's Bismarck, and I leave the Freudians among you to think about the sword, but here is Otto von Bismarck with his apron and his anvil as Siegfried. I think the image is quite clear. What is the meaning of Siegfried, at least according to this idea? Siegfried is reforging the nation. It's not only the sword, it is the nation, and credit here is given to Bismarck. So this was I have to say, one of my favorite objects in the belonging section of the exhibition. Here we have, on loan for the duration of the exhibition from the Wagner Museum in Bayreuth, the original diorama of Klingsor's garden from Parsifal. And I don't think it's my photograph, so I don't think it captures it terribly well. But this was interesting for many reasons, among them the history of stage design. This is a production that remained the only production in Bayreuth until the middle of the 1930s. And this is also a style and a principle of design involving successive vertical drops, which was still the main style at the Metropolitan Opera when I started going in the early 1970s. If you remember the really wonderful Eugene Berman productions all across the repertoire, that's what it all was. It was just hanging drops. There was really nothing architectural. But here you have Klingsor's gardens in the second act. And we had quite a bit of material about Parsifal because Parsifal in a way made its way from belonging, the sanctification of the house of the sanctification of the house of Bayreuth, and the re-sanctification with these bizarre sacred and bizarre confessional and largely Catholic principles in the work of Parsifal itself. This is a painting from mid-1870s involving a religious pilgrimage. It's a painting of a crowd at a railway station on their way to a site of pilgrimage. It has nothing to do with Bayreuth, but it has to do with the principle of religious pilgrimage. And the attraction of Bayreuth and the argument made about Bayreuth in the 1870s and then onward was that this was a site of pilgrimage as a way of recapturing and re-sanctifying really the truth and the heart of the German nation and German nationalism. So that going to Bayreuth was an act of national sanctification, national purification. And if you know the basic ritual of daily life in Bayreuth, I won't impose this on you guys when you go in the summer, but Bayreuth has a ritual, right? You get up in the morning, you slowly visit either the museum or Wagner's grave, you then have a very light bite to eat, and then you very slowly make your way up the Green Hill, whether you were walking or you're in a carriage, and you arrive at the top in time for the curtain at 4 o'clock, and you leave at 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock after 3 acts and 2 very long intermissions, and then you're allowed to end your fast, so to speak, and have something to eat after the performance. It's very ritualized. It's very anti-urban. In other words, it's a respite from the pollution of all kinds of urban life, and has nothing to do with going to the opera in the evening after a day's work. It's a completely different argument. It's in fact the contrary argument. And the last image was, in a way, one of the great pleasures of this exhibition, and that is, on the one side, you have everything that is problematic, nationalistic, chauvinistic, anti-Semitic about Bayreuth, about Parsifal. On the other hand, you have an acoustic experience that is unique. So Wagner, as you know, put it in his last will and testament that this work, which he did not describe as a music drama, but as a festival play for the consecration of the stage, right? Bühnenweihfestspiel, Parsifal is called, could by law only be performed in Bayreuth. I think this is probably not news to any of you this evening. So the work, in fact, was only performed in Bayreuth until the Metropolitan Opera decided to read American copyright law, which had a 20-year statute of limitations, which meant after Wagner's death in 1883, so that in 1903, the Metropolitan Opera broke the taboo and staged Parsifal, and the ice was broken really all over the world, much to Cosima Wagner's and the family's horror. But there's another side, and that is that Parsifal is the only work that Wagner wrote for the acoustic that he was developing in Bayreuth. The other works are adapted to the theater. Siegfried and Götterdämmerung were first performed in the theater, but they were written well before the theater was a reality. Parsifal was the only work that was written with the sound of the theater in mind. And for the great bells in the procession to the monastery of Montsalvat, Wagner had a local Bayreuth piano maker, a company called Steinberg, actually build an instrument that the local people speak of as the Parsifal keyboard, the Parsifal clavier. And this, to my surprise, is virtually unknown even to the artistic directors of opera houses in Germany and certainly outside of Germany, because almost everywhere there are bells used that are amplified. Recordings of bells used for these 4 notes, 2 intervals of fifths that make these bell sounds. But in the case of Parsifal in Bayreuth, some of you may have had this experience, the so-called Parsifal clavier is built into the floor under the stage in the pit. So the whole house resonates in a way that is really extraordinary. So for all of the irritating aspects, or more than irritating aspects of Wagner sanctifying his own theater with the exclusive performance of this work, there is also an acoustic argument that, in fact, it's a very different experience. And when I saw this, I was just thrilled. And it turns out that the company is now trying to sell replicas of the original Parsifal clavier. I don't know how successful they are, but there's an advertising campaign going on. I just this week looked at their website, and Christian Thielemann is right there saying it's the greatest thing he's ever heard. I asked the museum, what are we going to do? People have to hear this. And this problem was never solved because it's a respectable German museum. They obviously can't have several 100,000 people banging on the Parsifal clavier. So the compromise was they would have it on the website, but I asked permission to try it myself. And so here's my debut. And I'll end with this, if that's okay with you.
Thanks very much. Would you take some questions? All right. Me first. I get the sense, I did visit the installation, the exhibit. I get the sense that if you're not German, then there is some aspect of any German production that is not accessible to me. In other words, that when I go to see, not just Bayreuth, but if I see any production of Wagner, of any work of Wagner, I will be denied some aspect of what the director intended. Am I taking that too strongly, or do I get?
I wouldn't say you're being denied or excluded, But I think what you may be experiencing is what I talked about in mentioning the different responsibilities of directors and therefore of productions in Germany that have a responsibility to place Wagner within a very problematic history in a way that other opera houses don't feel that they have. They may have it, but they don't feel that they have it. So that a German argument, which is in a way the dramaturgical argument, that's why the dramaturge is a German position. It's something that exists in every theater in Germany. It hardly exists outside of Germany. It's this tradition, which is an old literary tradition, that becomes historically very important in a way legitimating in a critical way why this work should be performed. Why should it be performed at all? And in fact, if I can say something about the production I was involved in, one way the production was quite weak, I think, is in a way the other side of your question, and that is the director doesn't speak German. And so what he didn't do was actually direct the words from the text. Barenboim was very upset about this. In other words, he felt that the visual aspect of the production was beautiful, but that the characters, what the Germans call Personenregie, the direction of characters, were not being guided from the text because the director wasn't working really closely with the Germans. So that's the other side, what they need to do for a German audience.
Yeah, and just to underline that, I guess it isn't just the history. There's a sensibility, isn't there, of was ist Deutsch? And are there questions for the professor? Don't be shy.
Coming from a Latin American perspective, a lot of Latin Americans have noticed that great art can be made from great hatred. So Eckel, and I'm very surprised by Walfrid Meyer's kind of repression of that, considering that her first great role was Kundry. And if there's something that's hated in Wagner, it's her. So I just wanted to see how a little bit more focus on the disgust, whether it's bodily, ich bin frei, wirklich frei, and some of the more disgusting aspects, which are definitely there. And how did the museum handle that in that particular moment, as an exclusion from German sentiment?
Well, as you say, that was precisely the responsibility of that fourth section, even though the earlier ones, alienation, eros, and belonging, also have their exclusionary aspects as well. There's no inclusion without exclusion, if you think of the way nationalism works. But certainly, this question of disgust had to look at the late work in very interesting ways. One thing that was included that I didn't reproduce here was a section on medical history. In other words, how the body was actually being understood in medical advances in the late 19th century. The institution of the surgery theater, for example, where bodies were dissected and opened in a theatrical context, which meant we still use the term surgery theater, but if you look at the late 19th century portraits of very famous surgeons, you'll see an extremely theatrical layout of medical students peering down into open bodies. So there is this combination of this fascination with the inside of the body and medical advance. In the case of Parsifal, the basic racial metaphor, which Walfrid Meyer does not like to talk about, is in fact the whole idea of bad blood. So it's all about blood. So in the same way that blood was being understood through open bodies as a function of medical advance, bad blood is what quote-unquote scientific racism in the late 19th century is about. So in fact, the criminality and redemption story of Parsifal is about the redemption of bad blood. So that becomes the center of the story, but it's also about healing and love and redemption and inclusion. So Meyer thinks about the role of Kundry in terms of a kind of education of a fallen woman into salvation. So I think that's the way she answers the question, but it's a question of real debate.
It's an interesting imagery resident of Francois Girard's current production of Parsifal. Other questions?
So I've been doing some sort of very casual research, really about in post-Wagnerian Germany. And today, actually, I was happened to be reading Clara Schumann, about Clara Schumann, who I'm sure you know was Wagner was anathema to her. But the strange sense I've gotten, it's two things, and I hope this is a question, but I think it is. The sinister aspect I've sometimes identified with Wagner seems to be tied to me to his desire for financial success. I kind of have a feeling that his sort of incorporating everything into Bayreuth was his desire to really succeed. But at the same time, what I think he really isolated for many Germans, and even many that didn't really agree with him, was what it really meant to be German. That I think he was, and really I guess this is what I'm asking about. I mean, because I don't think he wasn't the only person to really try to establish what it meant to feel German and to be German. I mean, I think, but he was certainly one of the first. And the reason I mention the money is because the sense I have, and certainly Wilhelmine Germany, was that the more there was a feeling, the more you felt German, the more successful you would be. And that being German, embodying Germanness was a path to success. I wonder if that's...
Yeah, that's particularly pointed because at the time, Germany itself had yet fully to exist, didn't it? But it's in the themes of so many of the works that it's time to be German.
There's a lot of variety in feeling German. There's a lot of variety as the 19th century moves on, to say nothing of the 20th century. Still going on with the political changes, not only political parties, but geographic inclusion or exclusion. I actually like to provoke my students by telling them that, in fact, there has never been a unification of Germany, and therefore there has never been a reunification of Germany, because so many German speakers were excluded from unification in 1870, and with every articulation after that. So that's one easy point. But as I said earlier, the kind of marriage of nationalism and liberalism, meaning personal freedom, representative government, inclusion, multinationality, all of that was perfectly reasonable to many of those people in Frankfurt in 1848. Not all of them, but many of them. And that slowly disappears, also strategically, as to what can be achieved. Bismarck is a very important player in the reduction of that. So Wagner, if I can use this term, as a political market person, that's his genius in putting Bayreuth together as this way of reunifying, to be very schematic, the Protestant North and the Catholic South in ways that really signify to people, beyond political parties, which there were. There was a Catholic party and several Protestant parties. That's still the case in post-1945 Germany. But he really did it through feeling, it seems to me. And the business end is also very interesting. Wagner was also an amazing entrepreneur, largely in his own interests. But he was an amazing and very hardworking entrepreneur who traveled all across Europe conducting excerpts, largely orchestral excerpts from his work, because he could advertise it that way. Obviously there was no recorded music, so he worked very hard conducting excerpts in very long concerts all over the continent, while he couldn't get productions of his work on the stage, while at the same time having contempt for the moneymaker, money grubber, as being not essentially German, but being Jewish, because that's a standard cliche of anti-Semites, is that the Jews are about money. So he was quite neurotic about that. He was very good at it for the goal of Germanness, but he was also very self-aware that he may be acting Jewish by spending so much time making money. When I said earlier there was a certain kind of self-criticism, that's an unpleasant kind of self-criticism, but there are also times where he really does question his own prejudices, and it comes out in the music too.
Can we impose on you just?
Absolutely.
Okay. Well, let's have just one more. Yeah.
Many of us here saw both of the Girard productions, the Parsifal and the Lohengrin, and at the Met. And I was just wondering if you know about or had any interesting insights or thoughts or ideas about the productions.
You're going to get me in two very different kinds of trouble. I have not seen the Parsifal, just for no good reason. I just wasn't around when it was there. It looked extremely interesting to me, and I saw a bit of it just again through my own lack of focus, I guess. I just saw a bit of the first act. I did see, in fact, the premiere of the Lohengrin, and I thought that musically it was, on the whole, fantastic, and at its best, incredibly. I thought Bichawa's performance, it's exactly what I have in the back of my mind when I talk about why you need Italian singing when you sing Wagner. I thought it was just the most beautiful Wagner singing I'd ever heard. I thought the production was just outrageously bad.
Yeah.
I thought it was so bad you can't even joke about it. And a student of mine described the set as a screensaver seen from inside a toilet. I could never have come up with anything as horrible as that, but I tend to agree with him, so that's what I meant by getting into trouble.
Tell us what you really think about it. Professor Steinberg, thank you for spending the evening with us. We have some